Hey, what's going on, everyone? Hope you're doing well. My name is Jacob, and in this video, we're going to continue learning about making API requests inside of Bubble. In particular, we're going to start talking about authentication. So, authentication is a big topic that we haven't covered yet in this series. Previously, we've looked at the deck of cards API, which for our purposes, for learning about making API requests using the API connector, receiving a response, and using that data inside of our application, this worked great. But in reality, when you're in the wild dealing with all different sorts of APIs that you're going to deal with, you're almost always going to need to authenticate in some way. And authentication also, I think, happens to be the trickiest part of dealing with APIs, or at least it can be. So in this video, in the next few videos, actually, we're going to look at a few different methods of authentication. And what I really want you to do is to try to just focus on the underlying concepts that we're going to cover. I think that when dealing with authentication, it can be really easy to kind of get lost in the language when you're going through documentation, or to try to start memorizing where to put certain things inside of the API connector. But what I want you to do more so is to just focus on things at a fundamental level and to try to get some of these concepts that we're going to learn together. Because in reality, when you start going out and dealing with different APIs, the documentation that you're looking at is going to be different than the documentation I'm looking at. Your use case is going to be different than all of the different use cases we're practicing here together. And so being flexible, trying to understand things at that ground level will really help you go a long way. But anyways, we'll do our best here, and let's start from the ground up. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build out this simple app that will allow users to search for recipes based on ingredients that they have. We'll keep the actual design super simple, as you can tell here. User comes here, they type in the name of an ingredient to the input, they click on search, and when they click on search, we will fire off an API request to this Spoonacular API, which, as described right here, is the only food API you'll ever need. And what we'll do is we'll get a response back with different recipes that this user could use given the ingredients that they have. So if that sounds good, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm putting out here on YouTube, if you're excited about this, give me a thumbs up, make sure to subscribe, and do all of those things that YouTube likes you to do. And we'll get started by diving into the documentation here. So we'll go to the Spoonacular documentation. I'm going to close deck of cards because we don't really need it anymore. But actually, really quickly before I do, at first glance, this documentation that we're looking at here, this probably looks a little bit more intimidating than the documentation we were looking at in previous videos for the deck of cards API, right? And this looks a little bit closer to what you'll see with some of the other APIs that are quite popular. We have a list of different endpoints that we can hit on the left here. There's a description, some example requests. We'll go through all of this in a second, or at least one of the endpoints here. So let's go to search recipes by ingredients, which is the endpoint that we will be interacting with. And at this point, you should see some things on the screen that look familiar to you. We can see that this get method is here, and this looks like an endpoint that we can make a request to. We see a list of parameters here. Each parameter has a description. And if we keep scrolling down, we can see an example request and an example response here. So if we make a get request to this endpoint here, we should receive a response that looks like this, where we have missed ingredients. So the ingredients that they're including here are apples, flour, and sugar. This parameter to ingredients, let's read a little bit about it. A comma-separated list of ingredients that recipes should contain. Okay, makes sense. Looks like we have another parameter here, number. Remember, parameters are just key value pairs in the URL here that are separated by this ampersand. This question mark at the beginning will mark the beginning of the query string. So we have the path here, and then everything after this question mark is a set of key value pairs that are parameters. And this number parameter here, the maximum number of recipes to return between 1 and 100. Okay, so to get started, why don't we try to set this up in the API connector the same way that we did previously when dealing with deck of cards. I'm just going to copy this entire URL here. We'll head back over to the API connector and let's add another API. I'll call this Vernacular, and we're just going to set this up in the same way that we did before. So I'm still going to leave authentication as none or self-handled for now. We'll type in get recipes from ingredients, and let's just paste in this endpoint that we copied here with those parameters included. So we're making a GET request to this endpoint, and if we initialize the call, let's see what happens. Okay, so obviously it didn't work out. We get this message, failure, you are not authorized, please read this. Let's copy this URL here and open it in a new tab. Okay. So, authentication. To use the API, you need an API key. You can get a free one by simply signing up here. Now, in preparation for this video, I already went through this process, signed up, created a new account, so we have an API key that we can use. Once you have your API key, you have to put it in the request URL for every request you make, like so. You see this question mark again, and it's telling us to put our API key inside the request URL. Okay, so API key is a parameter name and with the value of our API key here. They have some information. We were already talking about this previously. Of course, we know that only the first query parameter is prefixed with this question mark. All subsequent ones will be prefixed with an ampersand. We already know this because we're expert Bubble developers. And it's saying too that this is not related to their API. This is just how URLs work. And they give a full example here. So imagine we're making a request to this endpoint, and look at that. They're attaching this API key as the name of the parameter with the value set to your API key. We sub this out for our API key, of course. Then we have this ampersand here, and they're including another example of a different parameter that you might include in this request. Parameters are case sensitive. Okay, helpful to know. Alternatively, you can put the API key in the request header as XAPI key. We're not going to talk about request headers in this video. We will in the future. But for now, let's just try to use this first method of authentication, which is going to be to include the API key here as a parameter and to attach it inside of that URL, inside of the request URL, as they tell us to do. So let's open my console in a new tab. And again, the reason I see this right now is because I'm actually signed in to Spoonacular API. This is a very common workflow when it comes to setting up an API connection too, right? So whether it's Spoonacular or Stripe or Twitter or Amazon, whatever it is, typically you're going to create an account with whatever service you're using, and they're going to, inside of your dashboard, give you some keys that you'll use inside of your request to authenticate, right? That's how, I mean, what are we dealing with authentication? What is authentication? It is proving who you are, right? So this key, I'm going to include it in my request so that Spoonacular can identify who's making that request and tie that request back to me personally in this case, right? So let's open my console in a new tab here. And this API key is under the profile section right here. API key is equal to this. Let's click show hide, or we'll show it in this case. And I'm going to copy this API key. We'll head back over to the API connector and let's follow the documentation. It's said to attach inside of the request URL here, it's said to attach that API key parameter. And so what we'll do is I'm just going to, let's actually clear all of this out and we'll just start from scratch with our parameters here. So let's go, I'm going to close deck of cards. We don't need that anymore. Let's go and look at our initial documentation. We have this endpoint with these parameters. And so let's start by attaching our API key right after this question mark here is the first parameter. So we'll go here, we'll say API key. Remember, it's case sensitive, they said. We'll say that is going to be equal to the key that we just copied. Now let's include another parameter like we have right here for ingredients. We'll say ingredients equals. Now remember, to separate my parameters, I'm going to include this ampersand here. And we're going to say ingredients is equal to, and I'll just type in apples for now. We could add in more. We could make this dynamic, as we will. We learned about how to make our calls or parts of our call dynamic in the previous video. But for now, while we are initializing this, I'm just going to hard code everything. And let's initialize the call to see if this works. Okay. As we've said previously, when you see a screen that looks like this when using the API connector and trying to initialize your calls, it's typically a good sign. Let's look at our data that we get back. It looks like we're getting an array of the title, 20 celebration, $500 giveaway. That's a weird title for a recipe. Let's keep scrolling. There we go. Apple ginger kombucha cocktail. That sounds a little bit more like an actual recipe. Looks like we're getting missed ingredients. And of course, we've seen all of this too. Looking at the documentation here, this is what this example response looks like, right? Which is what we're seeing. Cool. Now, I want you to pause for a second here and I really want to hammer this point home that yes, we've attached the API key as a parameter here, and we have successfully authenticated. But I don't want you to try to think, okay, well, this is the only way to actually send this API key parameter. All we're doing is we're attaching API key as a parameter inside of this request URL, right? But I can do this in other ways inside of the API connector, right? For example, if I delete this right now, so we just have the endpoint here, I can add parameters like this, right? So we can say API key is equal to, type in that key, ingredient, let's just type in apple, let's type in banana, we'll switch it up, and we'll reinitialize this call. And look at that, we're still getting back a successful response. So what's more important, rather than trying to memorize where you need to paste certain things inside of the API connector, is to just think about how we're authenticating here, which is how we are attaching information inside of the URL of our request, right? We're attaching it as a parameter in this case. And so obviously when we send this request, Spoonacular is going to look at the request URL that's coming in. It's going to look for that API key parameter, and it's going to grab that key that value that we're attaching there for that, right? Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great that we can attach an API key like that and authenticate successfully. Why do we even need this authentication option up here? Really good question, if you were thinking that. What this top section deals with inside of the API connector is kind of shared information for all calls. There's a little bit more to the authentication piece here, and we'll deal with some of these different authentication methods in future videos. What you can do if you want to read ahead, what I'd recommend is if you hover over this inside of the API connector and click on See Reference, and you actually click where it says See Here for details on each option, you can go through and read Bubble's own documentation about each one of these options, each one of these authentication methods that we have available to us. Really what they're trying to do, there are lots of different ways of authenticating API calls. Again, every API is going to be set up differently and have a different way of authenticating. You will, with more practice, start recognizing some of the more common ways of authenticating. But what Bubble's doing in this top section, what they're trying to do for us is to help us out with authentication. And some of these are quite complicated, which we'll get into in future videos. But Anyways, this top section here, you can see it's a little bit more obvious with adding a shared header for all calls. Again, we haven't talked about what headers are yet. We have talked about parameters. You can add a shared parameter as well, and that will add whatever information you put in up here to every call that we have below, right? So right now we've only set up one call here, get recipes from ingredients. But imagine that we wanted to go back to this API and set up, I don't know, set up a call to convert amounts or to search for grocery products. You may, when you're setting up your own API connections, just have a whole bunch of different calls for one single API that you're interacting with, right? And it would be a pain to have to go and add in your API key as an individual parameter to every single call if you have that over and over again, right? So you could, if you wanted to, add a shared parameter here, right? We could delete this here and add that as a shared parameter, and it would work the same way, right? Now, actually, at the time I'm recording this, there does seem to be a bug with this. So, for example, if I cut out my API key right here, I'm going to leave ingredients down here as a parameter because this parameter, it makes sense that this would be down here because this parameter is specific to this call, right? But an API key, something that I'm using over and over again to authenticate regardless of what call I'm making, that could be added as a shared parameter. But as I was preparing for this, and I added in API key here and tried to reinitialize the call, getting this error right here. Now, this actually seems to be on the bubble end of things at the moment, searching in the forum. Actually, this is the documentation that I was showing you, but searching in the forum, there do seem to be reports of this shared parameter not working at the time of this recording. Maybe at the time you're watching this video, it'll hopefully it'll be fixed by then. But this shared param, this in theory should work, right? Bubble will take this API. What should be happening here is they should be taking this parameter and attaching it to each endpoint here inside of that request URL and adding it onto whatever parameters already exist on the individual level. Another way that we could do this too, how are we authenticating here? We're attaching a key, a parameter inside of the URL, right? So I'm going to, let's just copy this again. Let's delete this shared parameter for all calls. And for authentication, I'm going to say, look at that. We can say we're going to attach a private key in the URL. The key name, let's say, is API key, and the value is going to be our API key right here. If we wanted to, sometimes when you're dealing with an API, you'll have a development key and a live key. So this is a nice feature actually that if we do use Bubble's built-in authentication method, of, in this case, a private key and URL, they do expose that development key value, and Bubble will handle that automatically for us. So if we're, for example, testing this API in development mode, they'll use the development key that we've entered here versus the live key if we're in version live. But let's initialize this call, and you can see here we go that Bubble's actually taking that API key, attaching it onto the request, and we can see that we get Boonana's Halloween snack returned to us, right? So the whole point in me explaining this to you is that I don't want you to, again, memorize what you need to do, where you need to paste things, because you can see just from this demonstration that there are a number of ways to actually successfully initialize this particular API call. And that's often the case with the API connector. So at this point, once we've initialized our call successfully and once we are receiving data back, everything becomes pretty easy for the most part, right? At this point, it's just a matter of taking this data and using it in our application. And we did a deep dive into this in the previous two videos. So I'm going to go through this next section really fast. And in future videos, I'm not even going to really worry about building out a sort of interface. We're just going to focus on the actual API connection and initializing the call. But let's get this set up. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to uncheck private here, and we're going to make this dynamic. because ingredients is going to be dynamic, obviously. If we go look at the design again, the user is going to type in the name of an ingredient. And why don't we make this a little bit more interesting? We'll say type the name of an ingredient, of ingredients. Say, what ingredients do you have? And we'll assume that we'll just say separate each one. Actually, no, let's not do that. What we would do is we would make sure to educate our users here that we want them to type in a comma separated list. And we're going to assume that our users know exactly how we want them to type this information into this input. And what we'll do then is we'll say, first of all, let's think about this for a second. In this repeating group, what do we want to do? We don't want this to be type of content image. We want this to be a get recipes from ingredients. So if we go back to the design tab and there we go, get recipes from ingredients. We'll leave the data source blank right now because we are going to make this API request when this button is clicked here, get that response and throw it into this repeating group here inside of a workflow action. Now, in order to do that, right now, if we click on this data source and we say get data from an external API, you can see that Spinacular is, I don't know how to pronounce that at all, is listed here as a data call, right? But we don't want that. So we want to get rid of the data source here. We're going to go to our plugins and change this to use as data to use as an action so that we can use it inside of our workflows. Let's go over to the workflow tab then. We'll say start edit workflow when button search is clicked. And we will say plugins, Spinacular, get recipes from ingredients. What we'll do then is we'll take whatever the user puts inside of input, presumably that input. Let's go and rename it. We'll say input ingredients. And you can see that we're being asked for these ingredients now. So let's take input ingredients value. And if we look at the API documentation here, you can see that we have this comma separated list. And why don't we, it looks like we have to add this plus sign too and get rid of that space, right? So let's say input ingredients value trimmed, first of all. So we'll get rid of any space at the beginning or the end. And then we'll also say find and replace. We'll type in a space with a plus sign here. Okay. Now, again, if you were actually building out this feature, you wouldn't want to rely on this logic here to make sure that your users are giving you the type of or the ingredients that they have in this case in a format that actually makes sense, right? You would want to maybe use some regex or however, there's a number of different ways that you could approach this problem, but I would definitely not recommend doing just this and relying on your users to type stuff in the way that you want them to, because they won't, right? So let's see, we're going to get a response here. We'll say that we'll take the response and display a list inside of a repeating group. The repeating group that we want to display, there's only one on the page, so Bubble knows which repeating group that is. And we'll take the result of step one. And because we've set the type of content of this repeating group to be get recipes from ingredients, and the data that we're receiving from step one is a list of those recipes, we get this nice blue expression here. And Bubble's happy with us. So let's keep the design super simple. And what we'll do is we'll just put in the name of the recipe, the title of the recipe. We'll copy and paste that. And we'll say here we want the used ingredients. And let's just say each item's name. Remember this used ingredients, if we look at the actual data here, looks like it is, well, these are missed ingredients. used ingredients here, we get a list of each one of these is an ingredient, right? Name apples. Okay, cool. So we'll say each item's name, missing ingredients. For this next one, we'll say each item's name. Let's give this a different color and a little bit of a different style. So missing ingredients, let's put that in red because it's missing. And we'll change this to 15. Let's actually just, so we don't have to go through that styling again, we'll just do this used ingredients, and we'll change the color of this to be green. Okay, and then that's it for now. So let's preview this and see if this works. Get rid of the debugger on the bottom, and we'll say apples, bacon, and I don't know, crackers. Holiday bacon appetizers. We have bacon and crackers. We're missing Parmesan cheese, bacon wrapped cream cheese crackers. This is making me hungry. I'm actually super hungry right now. So the important part is we're getting back a list of recipes here. Everything looks like it's working. It's ordered bacon cheddar kebabs with bacon and Granny Smith apple. Very interesting. Okay. I hope you found that video useful. I hope that this was a rather simple form of authentication. We're going to look at a few more complicated examples in the next few videos. But I hope you found this useful. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.